It was October 14th, 1966, and Earl Hutchins was 41 years old when he made a deal that would define the rest of his farming life. He stood in the equipment yard of Peterson Massey Ferguson in Worthington, Minnesota, with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at a machine that seemed too large for what he actually needed. The Massey Ferguson 1100 sat there under the autumn sun, red and silver, diesel engines silent, bigger than anything he'd ever owned. The dealer, a man named Gordon Peterson, didn't push. He just waited. Earl had already said yes in his mind. What he was doing now was convincing himself it was the right kind of yes. Earl farmed 640 acres of corn and soybeans outside of Brewster, Minnesota, land that had been in his family since 1919. He wasn't the first son, he was the third. His older brothers had left for Minneapolis and Sioux Falls in the 1950s, which meant the farm came to him not by preference, but by process of elimination. He'd married young to a woman named Doris who grew up 4 miles north, and by 1966 they had 3 children under the age of 10. The farm made money most years. It wasn't wealth, but it was steady. Earl was careful. He kept good records. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't carry unnecessary debt. People in Brewster said he was dependable, which in that place and time was a compliment that mattered. He ran 4 tractors, a 1952 Massey Harris 44, a 1958 Massey Ferguson 65, a 1961 Massey Ferguson 50, and a 1963 Massey Ferguson 135. Each had a role. The 44 handled heavy tillage in the spring, the 65 pulled the grain wagon during harvest, the 50 ran the rotary hoe and lighter field work. The 135 was used for everything else: mowing, baling, hauling, odd jobs around the yard. It wasn't an elegant system, but it worked. When one tractor went down, he had 3 others. When parts were slow to arrive, he could shuffle work around. He'd learned this flexibility from his father, who had farmed through the Depression with even less. But Earl had been adding acres. In 1964, he'd rented an additional 160 acres from a neighbor who'd retired. In 1965, another 80 from a widow whose sons had no interest in coming back. By the fall of 1966, he was working 880 acres total, and the 4-tractor system that had been sufficient for 640 was now stretched too thin. He was running longer days, starting earlier, finishing later, and still falling behind. The 44 was 34 years old and burning oil. The 65 had a hydraulic leak he couldn't quite solve. The 50 was underpowered for what he was asking it to do. The 135 was fine, but it was small. Gordon Peterson had called him in late September. He said he had something Earl should see. When Earl arrived, Peterson walked him past the new models and stopped in front of the 1100. It had just come in. 95 horsepower, diesel, 4-wheel drive available, though this one was 2-wheel. It could pull a 6-bottom plow where Earl's 44 struggled with 4. It could cover ground faster, deeper, cleaner. Peterson didn't say Earl needed it. He said it might make sense given the acreage. Earl didn't make a decision that day. He went home and thought about it for 2 weeks. He ran the numbers at the kitchen table after Doris and the kids were asleep. The 1100 cost $8,500 new. Peterson was offering him $4,200 in trade for all 4 of his current tractors. That meant financing $4,300, which at 6% over 5 years came to about $83 a month. It was manageable, but it also meant reducing 4 tractors to 1. That was the part that troubled him. He talked to Doris about it. She asked him what would happen if the big tractor broke down. He said he'd get it fixed. She asked what would happen if it broke down during harvest. He said he'd get it fixed faster. She didn't argue, but she didn't agree either. She just listened, which was her way of letting him know the decision was his to make and his to live with. Earl went back to Peterson on October 14th. He brought the titles for all 4 tractors. Peterson had the paperwork ready. They signed in the office, and then Earl drove the Massey Ferguson 1100 off the lot and back to Brewster, leaving the 44, the 65, the 50, and the 135 behind. It felt efficient. It felt modern. It felt like the kind of decision a serious farmer made when he was thinking about the future. The first year went exactly the way Earl had hoped. The 1100 handled the spring tillage in half the time the 44 had required. It didn't burn oil, it didn't overheat, it pulled a six-bottom plow through heavy clay without complaint. Earl finished planting a week earlier than he had the previous year, which gave the crop a better start. When neighbors stopped by and saw the 1100 sitting in the yard, they asked him how he liked it. He said it was the best piece of equipment he'd ever owned, and he meant it. Harvest that fall was smooth. The 1100 pulled the grain wagon without strain, kept pace with the combine, handled the wet spots near the creek where the 65 used to bog down. Earl paid the first year of the loan off without difficulty. By the end of 1967, he'd convinced himself that trading 4 tractors for one had been the smartest move he'd made in a decade. But there were small things he didn't notice right away. Things that only became clear when they stopped being available. He no longer had a second tractor to move wagons while the 1100 was in the field. He no longer had a light tractor for quick trips to town or running the post pounder or pulling the manure spreader on short notice. Everything now required the 1100, which meant everything had to be planned around the 1100. If he needed to bale hay in the afternoon, he had to finish the morning's tillage first. If the grain wagon needed moving, the plowing had to stop. It wasn't a crisis, it was just a new kind of rigidity. In 1968, the 1100 developed a small hydraulic leak near the remote cylinder. Earl fixed it himself, replaced a seal, bled the system. It took half a day. In 1969, the starter solenoid failed in the middle of May planting. He had to pull the tractor into the shed, order the part from Peterson, wait 3 days for it to arrive, install it, and lose nearly a week of good planting weather. In 1970, the clutch began slipping under heavy load. He adjusted it twice before accepting that it needed to be replaced, which required pulling the engine, a job he couldn't do alone. He hired a mechanic from Worthington, paid $320 for the repair, and was back in operation 4 days later. None of these problems were unusual. Tractors broke down. Earl had always known that. The difference was that before, when one tractor went down, he had 3 others. Now, when the 1100 went down, everything stopped. He still had the financing to worry about, which meant he couldn't afford to let repairs pile up. Every breakdown had to be addressed immediately, which made each one more expensive in both time and money than it would have been if he'd had the flexibility to wait for parts or shop around for better prices. Doris noticed the change before he did. She saw him come in from the field earlier than he used to, not because the work was done, but because the tractor needed something. She saw him on the phone with Peterson more often, ordering parts, asking about availability, trying to solve problems that couldn't wait. She didn't say anything because Earl didn't seem worried. He seemed busy, which to him was normal. By 1972, Earl had paid off the loan. The 1100 was his, free and clear, and it had performed well. He'd kept up with the work, kept the acres productive, kept the operation moving forward. He convinced himself that the early repairs had just been bad luck, that the tractor was now broken in and would settle into a long period of reliability. He was 47 years old. His oldest son, Danny, was 16 and starting to help more in the fields. Earl began to think about what the farm would look like in another 10 years, when Danny might take over. But in 1973, fuel prices doubled. The cost of running the 1100, which burned more diesel than any of the smaller tractors ever had, became a line item that couldn't be ignored. Earl had traded 4 tractors for one, in part because he thought it would be more efficient, and in terms of time, it was. But in terms of fuel, it wasn't. The 1100 drank diesel whether it was pulling a heavy load or a light one, whether it was working or just moving between fields. The smaller tractors had been inefficient in their own ways, but at least he'd had the option of using the least powerful machine for lighter jobs. Now, everything required the same 95 horsepower, whether it needed it or not. Earl didn't complain. Complaining wasn't his nature. He adjusted. He planned trips more carefully. He combined tasks to reduce idle time. He kept working, kept planting, kept harvesting. The 1100 was still the best tractor he'd ever owned. It was just more expensive to operate than he'd anticipated, and there was no going back. In 1975, Danny graduated from high school. Earl assumed he'd stay on the farm, but Danny had other ideas. He'd been accepted to a technical school in Mankato to study diesel mechanics. He said he liked working on equipment more than working with it, and he wanted to learn how to do it properly. Earl didn't argue. He told Danny to go, learn what he needed to learn, and come back when he was ready. But privately, Earl felt the loss. He'd been counting on Danny's help, not just for the labor, but for the continuity. The farm had been in the family for 56 years. Earl had assumed it would continue. Marshall, where the pay was steadier and the hours more predictable. Earl managed, but the workload grew heavier. He was 50 years old, and he could feel the difference. His back hurt more. His knees were stiffer in the mornings. The 1100 still ran, but operating it for 12-hour days took more out of him than it used to. In 1977, the injector pump on the 1100 began to fail. It started as a rough idle, then progressed to hard starting, then to a loss of power under load. Earl knew what it was before the mechanic confirmed it. Injector pumps on diesel engines were expensive to rebuild and complicated to replace. He took the tractor to a Massey Ferguson service center in Sioux Falls, the closest place with the equipment to do the work properly. They kept it for 11 days. The repair cost $150. Earl paid it, drove the tractor home, and went back to work. But the timing was bad. It was late April, and he was already behind on planting because of wet weather. Losing the tractor for 11 days put him even further behind, and by the time he got back into the field, the soil conditions were less than ideal. He planted anyway, because waiting wasn't an option, but the stands that year were uneven. Yields were down 15%, which translated to lost income he couldn't recover. Doris asked him if he'd thought about buying a second tractor, something smaller, just as a backup. Earl said he'd thought about it, but it didn't make financial sense. A second tractor meant another payment, another insurance cost, another machine to maintain. The 1100 was enough, as long as it didn't break down at the wrong time. Doris didn't push, but the question stayed with him. In 1978, diesel prices spiked again. The cost of fuel became the single largest variable expense on the farm, larger than seed, larger than fertilizer, larger than repairs. Earl started tracking fuel usage more carefully, writing down every gallon, calculating cost per acre, trying to find inefficiencies he could eliminate. But there was only so much he could do. The 1100 was what it was. It required the fuel it required. He could drive it more carefully, avoid unnecessary idling, plan routes to minimize empty travel, but the baseline consumption didn't change. That same year, a neighbor named Clifford Benson retired and sold his equipment at auction. Clifford had farmed with 3 smaller tractors, none of them as powerful as the 1100, but all of them paid off and functional. Earl went to the auction, not to buy, but to see what the equipment brought. The tractors sold for less than he expected, but the buyers were younger farmers just starting out, men who needed affordable equipment more than they needed efficiency. Earl watched them load the tractors onto trailers and drive away, and he thought about the 4 machines he'd traded in 1966. He wondered where they were now, whether they were still working, whether the men who owned them had the flexibility he used to have. By 1980, Earl was 55 years old. Danny had finished his training and taken a job at a dealership in Marshall. He came home on weekends sometimes, but it was clear he wasn't coming back to the farm. Earl's 2 younger children, both daughters, had moved to Sioux Falls and started families of their own. The farm, which had been in the family for 61 years, no longer had an obvious successor. Earl thought about selling, but the idea felt like failure. His father had survived the Depression to keep the farm going. His grandfather had broken the prairie to start it. Earl had spent 34 years maintaining it, and the thought of being the one to let it go was unbearable. So he kept working. He kept planting. He kept running the Massey Ferguson 1100, which by now was 14 years old and showing its age. The tractor still ran, but it required more attention. The steering was loose. The brakes were soft. The electrical system had developed intermittent problems that were hard to diagnose. Earl had become skilled at field repairs, at carrying spare parts, at knowing which problems could wait and which couldn't. He'd learned to listen to the engine, to feel changes in performance before they became failures. The 1100 had become an extension of himself, and he knew it better than any machine he'd ever owned. But he also knew he was depending on it in a way that wasn't sustainable. He had no backup. He had no margin for error. If the 1100 went down at the wrong time, he had no way to recover. In the summer of 1981, the transmission began to slip. It started in fifth gear, a slight hesitation under load, a momentary loss of power that Earl could feel through the seat. He downshifted to fourth, and the problem went away. For a few weeks, he worked around it, avoiding fifth gear, accepting the lower speed. But by late July, fourth gear was slipping too. Then third. By August, the tractor could barely pull a loaded grain wagon without losing power. Earl knew what it meant. The transmission needed to be rebuilt. It wasn't a repair he could do himself, and it wasn't a repair that could wait. Harvest was 6 weeks away. If the tractor failed during harvest, he'd lose the crop. He called the service center in Sioux Falls and described the problem. They told him to bring it in as soon as possible, that a full transmission rebuild would take 2 to 3 weeks and cost between $2,800 and $3,500, depending on what they found when they opened it up. Earl didn't have $3,500. He had savings, but they were earmarked for property taxes, insurance, seed for the next year. Spending that money on a transmission repair would leave him exposed in other areas. He thought about financing the repair, but at 56 years old, with no clear successor and an uncertain future, taking on debt felt reckless. He thought about selling the 1100 as is and buying something smaller, something used, something he could afford outright. But a tractor with a failing transmission wouldn't bring much at auction, and anything reliable enough to replace it would cost more than the repair. He was trapped between options that all felt wrong. Doris suggested he call Danny, see if Danny knew anyone who could do the work cheaper. Earl resisted at first, because asking his son for help felt like admitting he couldn't manage on his own. But finally, he made the call. Danny said he'd ask around, see what he could find. 3 days later, Danny called back. He'd talked to a mechanic in Marshall, a man who did side work out of his garage, rebuilding transmissions for farmers who couldn't afford dealership prices. The man's name was Roy Tenner, and he said he could do the work for $1,800 if Earl could get the tractor to him, and didn't mind waiting 3 weeks. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't convenient, but it was half the price of the dealership. Earl agreed. He drove the 1100 to Marshall on a Saturday in mid-August, barely making it the 30 miles without the transmission failing completely. Roy Tenner met him in the driveway of a small house on the south edge of town, a man in his 60s with oil-stained hands and a shop that looked like it had been built from salvaged materials. Earl helped him push the tractor into the garage, and then Roy drove him back to Brewster in a pickup that smelled like diesel and cigarettes. 3 weeks became 4. Roy called to say he'd found more damage than he'd expected, that the clutch packs were worn beyond spec, that some of the bearings needed replacing. He said he could still do the work for $1,800, but it would take longer. Earl said that was fine, even though it wasn't. Harvest was 2 weeks away, and he didn't have a tractor. He called neighbors, asking if anyone had equipment he could rent or borrow. Most of them were preparing for their own harvests and couldn't spare anything. Finally, a man named Albert Goss, who farmed 3 miles east, said Earl could use his Massey Ferguson 175 if he paid for the fuel and any repairs. It wasn't charity. It was the kind of arrangement farmers made when they had no other choice. Earl harvested his corn and soybeans with Albert's 175, working 12-hour days, getting the crop out before the weather turned. The 175 was smaller than the 1100, less powerful, slower, but it worked. Earl finished the harvest on October 9th, 2 days before the first hard freeze. The yields were average, the crop was safe, but the entire experience had reminded him of something he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. Flexibility mattered more than power. Roy Tenner called on October 12th. The transmission was done. Earl drove to Marshall with Danny, who had taken the day off to help. They loaded the 1100 onto a flatbed trailer Danny had borrowed from the dealership, and they hauled it back to Brewster. Earl paid Roy $1,800 in cash, money he'd pulled from savings he couldn't afford to lose. Roy handed him a receipt written on the back of an envelope and said the transmission should be good for another 10 years if Earl didn't abuse it. Earl drove the 1100 off the trailer and into the machine shed. It ran smoothly. The transmission shifted cleanly, no slipping, no hesitation. The repair had been done properly. But Earl didn't feel relief. He felt exhausted. He was 56 years old, and he'd just spent 4 weeks improvising his way through a crisis that wouldn't have been a crisis if he'd kept a second tractor. That winter, Earl thought about the decision he'd made in 1966. He thought about the 4 tractors he'd traded away, the 44 and the 65 and the 50 and the 135. He thought about the flexibility they'd given him, the freedom to keep working when one went down, the ability to match the machine to the task. He thought about the Massey Ferguson 1100, which had been exactly what he'd needed in terms of power and efficiency, and exactly the wrong choice in terms of resilience. He didn't regret buying the 1100. It had been a good tractor, and it had served him well. What he regretted was the trade. He regretted reducing 4 machines to 1. He regretted believing that efficiency and reliability were the same thing. He regretted not keeping one of the smaller tractors, just in case. In the spring of 1982, Earl planted with the 1100. The transmission held. The tractor performed as it should. But Earl no longer trusted it the way he once had. Every unusual sound, every slight vibration, every momentary hesitation made him tense. He'd learned that a single point of failure was still a single point of failure, no matter how well built the machine. By 1985, Earl was 60 years old. The 1100 was 19 years old. It still ran, but it was showing its age in ways that couldn't be repaired. The engine had 12,000 hours on it. The hydraulics were slow. The sheet metal was rusted through in places. The seat was held together with duct tape. It was still functional, but it was no longer reliable in the way Earl needed it to be. He started looking at used equipment, smaller tractors he could afford outright, machines that could serve as backups. He found a 1978 Massey Ferguson Tune 55 at an auction in Luverne, a tractor with 3,000 hours and a recent engine overhaul. It wasn't as powerful as the 1100, but it was dependable, and the price was right. Earl bought it for $4,200, the exact amount he'd financed for the 1100 19 years earlier. Having 2 tractors again changed everything. Earl could plan work without panic. He could schedule maintenance without losing days. He could let the 1100 sit when it needed rest, and he could run the 255 for lighter work without burning unnecessary fuel. It was a system that should have been obvious 15 years earlier, but Earl had needed those 15 years to understand why it mattered. In 1988, Earl sold the 1100. It had 14,500 hours on it, and the frame was cracked near the front axle. He took it to an auction in Worthington, the same town where he'd bought it in 1966. It sold for $1,800, the same amount he'd paid Roy Tenner for the transmission rebuild 7 years earlier. The buyer was a younger farmer who said he planned to use it for heavy tillage and didn't care about the cosmetics. Earl watched the tractor roll onto a trailer and disappear, and he felt nothing. It had been a good machine. It had also taught him something he wished he'd known earlier. Earl kept farming until 1994, when he was 69 years old. He sold the land to a corporate operation out of Iowa, and he sold the equipment at auction. The Massey Ferguson 255 brought $3,100, which was less than he'd paid for it, but enough. He and Doris moved into Worthington, into a house near the center of town, and he spent the last years of his life within sight of the dealership where he'd made the decision that had shaped everything that followed. People who knew Earl said he'd been a good farmer. He'd kept the land productive. He'd honored his debts. He'd survived lean years and modest ones and a few good ones. But when people asked him what he'd learned from 48 years of farming, he didn't talk about yields or markets or weather. He talked about the day he traded 4 tractors for 1, and how efficiency and resilience were not the same thing, and how the difference had taken him 20 years to understand. The Massey Ferguson 1100 had been the best tractor he'd ever owned. It had also been the decision that taught him what best actually meant, and what it cost when you built everything around a single point of failure.